Hello, we're going to be in chapter 3 and 4. I hope you'll get your Bibles and follow with me. Now, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. This seems to point toward that thing we talked about last time about the discrepancy between Ish-bosheth reigned 2 years and David 7.5. It is quite possible that there's a long period of conflict between Judah and Israel that we're not really told a lot about. We're just told a couple of points of it. And this may reflect something much longer than that. David grew steadily stronger. The house of Saul grew continually weaker. And, of course, that's exactly what happened we saw last time in the death of 19 of David's army, but 300 and something, 60 of Saul's army, now Ish-bosheth. And the sons born to David at Hebron. Now, from verses 2 through verse 5, we're going to list 6 sons. It's also going to have 6 different wives. We show that since he moved to Hebron, he's taken 4 more wives. And this is exactly against Deuteronomy 17:17. But David was trying to play the part of an oriental potentate, and he certainly does it by having all these wives. So the blessing of children was a sign of God's blessing, and the multiple wives would have been ways for the other tribes to see David as a very important civil leader. Now, his firstborn was Amnon. Of course, we learned the tragedy of this firstborn son in chapter 13, where he raped one of his half-sisters, Tamar, and her brother, Absalom, is going to kill him. And we'll see that in chapter 13. Now, the second son is called Chilib. Now, this is not seen to be his name, for in the parallel of this, in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, he's called Daniel. The Mishnah on this passage says this little is like a nickname at home, which means very much like your father. And maybe he looked like David or something. We're just not sure. The third son is Absalom, of course, and in 2 Samuel chapters 14 through 18 will be given over to the record of his rebellion, how he stood in the gate and tried to trick the people's heart to follow him and not follow his father, and how his father had to flee from his own son. Now, it's interesting to me as I look at this Absalom. We know he was a tall, dark-headed man, handsome man. His mother is mentioned, and she is from a small country called Geshur, which is northeast of the Sea of Galilee, okay, the Transjordan area, the area of Bashan. Now, it's interesting to me that her father's name is Talmai. Now, Talmai is one of the names of the Anakim, or the giants, in Numbers 13:22. It's also the same geographical area of this nation, Geshur, is where Og, the king of Bashan, lived, who was also one of these giants. We learned from Deuteronomy 3:11. So maybe some of this very tallness came from his ancestry, though we're just not sure. The fourth son is Adonijah. Now, Adonijah is another son of David that rebelled, but he rebelled after David's death, and he tried to take the kingship when David died. And Solomon is going to have to kill him in 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. So we see here some of the problems in David's family that was predicted by the prophet Nathan for David's sin with Bathsheba and the killing of Uriah. Now, the fourth son is also here mentioned, and the sixth son is also here mentioned, but there is no other references to them in the Bible, so we know nothing about them. Now, beginning in chapter 6. And it came about when there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now, Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah. She's mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 21, verse 8 and following. And Ish-bosheth said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" That was a great question, because the taking of a concubine, taking of a woman who is part of the king's harem, is a way of claiming kingship for yourself. It looks like Abner always had that in mind. And this seems to be part of the plan. You might want to see this same kind of thing in 2 Samuel 16:22 and 1 Kings 2:22 and 23. It happens other times and with the same view of treason. And Abner was very angry over the words of Ish-bosheth and said, "Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah?" It's a question. It's kind of, am I a useless traitor? Now, the word dog has been used as a metaphor of derision several times in the historical books. Remember back in 1 Samuel 17:43 and 24:14, where David makes an allusion to that as Saul is trying to chase him. So it was definitely a term of derision. Now, Abner kind of says to him, I've been good to you. I'm the only reason you're in power, and you're picking on me about something like this. Even the end of verse 8 says, how dare you attack me over a mere woman? That's kind of the view. How could you bring this up just over a girl, he's saying. Now, in verse 9, he begins to say, as the Lord has sworn to David. Now, what is Abner referring to? Well, probably several times where God mentioned through Samuel that David was going to be king of Israel. Here's some examples of this. Would be 1 Samuel 15:28, 1 Samuel 16:13, 1 Samuel 25, verse 28 through 31. So it must have been well known what God had promised to David through Samuel. If Abner knew it, you know that many people in the north knew it. Now in verse 10, it says, I'm going to hand over Israel to Judah from Dan to Beersheba. Now, of course, from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 20, this became a metaphor for the entire promised land. Dan, as you know from the ending of Judges, had moved its tribal allocation from close to Simeon and Judah to the far north, and they named the city Dan. So it's the farthest north of the promised land. And of course, Beersheba is a southern Negev city of Judah, and it became a way of referring to the whole promised land. Now, verse 11 shows the uniqueness of and weakness of Ish-bosheth, and he could do nothing to control Abner. Abner was really the power behind the throne here. Verse 12, and Abner sent messages to David in his palace, saying, whose is the land? Now, this may be a reference to the land may be yours by God's promise, but the north belongs to me as far as possession. We're not real sure. Make your covenant with me. Now, what does that mean? Maybe a covenant of friendship and peace to forgive the blood feuds between the civil war that had occurred, all the problems and killings that had occurred. That seems to be the issue here. And behold, my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel over to you. That's exactly what David wanted to do. That's been his purpose all along. So, of course, he was thrilled to death to hear about this. And he said, good, I'll make a covenant with you, but I demand one thing, namely you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me. Now, of course, Michal had originally been given to David. She was promised to the one that killed Goliath. But even later on, Saul made some other demands, like 100 foreskins of the Philistines. David brought him 200 foreskins. And we see that in 1 Samuel 18:20 through 27. So David was given Saul's daughter. But after David fled, Saul, in his anger and jealousy and paranoia, gave Michal to another man. We see it in 1 Samuel 25:44. She had been living with this man for about 8 or 9 years now. Now, was this romantic on David's part? Well, you can't interpret the Bible psychologically. He still may have cared very deeply for her. They had some tensions, but he may have cared very deeply for her and wanted her back. It may have been a point of shame, but it's certainly a point of political prowess to want to unite all the tribes and to be the husband of Saul's daughter would have given David one more element, one more evidence of why he should be king. But notice in verse 14, he sends messengers to Ish-bosheth. He wanted this done officially and publicly to show his power. In verse 16, we see the tragic sign of her husband following after her and weeping all the way to the borders of Judah. And finally, Abner said, go home, quit this. It's sad. This whole thing is sad. Saul giving her to another man is sad. The other man accepting her, knowing that she's David's wife, is sad. David demanding her back. This whole thing is terrible, and we see some of that here in verse 16. Now Abner had consultation with the elders of Israel, saying, in times past you were seeking David to be the king over you. Now that's interesting that he would admit that. That shows there's always been a strain or a group, even among the north, that wanted David to be king. And this is an admittance of that. Now then do it, for the Lord has spoken to David. Now this seems to be a reference to 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 16, or possibly 1 Samuel 15:28, or even more possibly 28, verses 17 and 18. The hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Now, obviously, the Israel being split into factions that are fighting each other was good news for the Philistines. They didn't have to plan much militarily for an enemy that was having civil strife. And I think Abner realized that until Israel was united together, there was no possibility of throwing off this Philistine yoke. Let's see. Notice in verse 19, he's going to talk in the hearing of Benjamin. Now, Benjamin, of course, was Saul's tribe, and what Abner tries to do is make special arrangements with them to explain to them why David should be king and why he was going to support David. I'm sure since Saul was dead and Ish-bosheth was across the Jordan in the Transjordan area, that all the accoutrements that came to Benjamin for being the tribe of the king were present no more. And so it wasn't that big a decision to make. Abner seems to speak at Hebron and in presence of all of Israel about his plans to unite the kingdom under David. Verse 20, Abner and 20 men came with him to David at Hebron. And David made a feast. Now the feast here implies a covenantal feast. These 20 men, are they just special men of Abner's army? Well, some have said they are chieftains, but maybe chieftains in the sense of the elders of Israel. And we're not really sure who they are, but they come for this meeting and this special covenant time. It's very interesting to me that verse 21 closes in this way. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Now this little phrase, in peace, is repeated at the end of verse 22, at the end of verse 23, and it is even present in the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, the Greek translation, at the end of verse 24. It is obviously David's way, or the writer's way, of showing that David had no foreknowledge of Joab's treacherous assassination plans, that David and Abner left as friends, covenant friends, in peace, and that's repeated over and over through here. Now, it seems that Abner had been out. We learned from verse 22 that he had been on a raid. Now, this raid shows several things. It shows that the lifestyle of David's band of thieves and robbers had not changed a whole lot. They were still supporting themselves through raids, probably these desert Arab tribes. It also shows that though David may try to want to change this, it was very hard. Abner was a very strong military commander, and he had been away. Some think that David planned this meeting with Abner because Joab was away. We're just not sure about that. It's reading too much into the text. When Joab came back, he was furious. In verse 25, he tells David, this man is just trying to trick you. He's just out to destroy you. Now, folks, we can't read the mind of Abner. It seems like he was trying to control Ish-bosheth. It seems like he was wanting to be king of Israel. Maybe this was a trick. We're just not sure. There was enough in Abner to say, yes, there may be some evidence for this. So Joab may have been speaking the truth. But it seems that Joab is speaking out of rivalry, out of personal revenge, not simply out of his care for David at this point. So Joab sent for Abner secretly, and that shows the power of Joab. And Abner had got as far as the well of Sirah. Now we learn from Josephus in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, book 8, chapter 1, verse 5. This was about 2.5 miles north of Hebron, so Abner had not got very far. Abner returned to Hebron. Joab took him aside in the middle of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he stuck him in the belly so that he died on account of the blood of Ashiel, his brother. This goes back to the count, back in chapter 2, verse 18 through 25, where Abner killed Ashiel, the younger brother of Joab. Now, there are several things here. Number one, you may say, well, Joab was just acting as the blood avenger, or the Goel. That may be true, but in chapter 3, verse 30, it says that Ashiel was killed in battle. Now, that means it was a different grounds than this blood revenge between other situations. So the fact he was killed in war means there was no Goel involved. Number two, some say Hebron, they make note that Hebron is a Levitical city. Not only a Levitical city, but from Joshua chapter 20, verse 7, we learn it was one of the cities of refuge. And so even if there was the Goel involved, he could not kill Abner in the city. But the truth is, this has nothing to do with that. This is just revenge. Now, meaning he took him aside, many of us think that the gates of these ancient cities had little rooms, as Megiddo and Hazor do, we found archaeologically. So he took him in privately, apparently as if he had a word to tell him from David, something like that. Abner was caught off guard and was killed. And afterwards David heard he said, I and my kingdom are innocent before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner, son of Ner. Now, David never forgot this impulsive act. Matter of fact, he's going to get Solomon to kill Joab because of it. 1 Kings 2:5. He even curses Joab and his family. It's another way of David trying to distance himself from some of the unfortunate circumstances that he got himself in. David's mind wants to unite the tribes under one king. And he's having all of these circumstantial problems. He thought he had it done with Abner. And now one of his own trusted companions does a treacherous act that stopped the whole covenant from going into effect. It took many more years to get it done. Listen to what he said. May it fall on the head of Joab and all of his father's house. May there not fail from the house of Joab one who has a discharge. Now, from Leviticus chapter 15, this would be someone who is ceremonially unclean, could not attend worship, could not attend social functions. The second one, who is a leper. This goes back to Leviticus 13:14. Terrible social disease, often thought as given by God to punishment of sin. One who holds the distaff. There are two possibilities here. Some say a distaff is something to do with spinning and weaving of material. Some would say a man has to do a woman's work. Others say it's a physically crippled man who can't do any work but this. We're not sure which it is. Who falls by the sword. In other words, they're destroyed in battle. And finally, who lacks bread or has the curse of poverty. It's a strong curse, I guarantee you. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. Note the battle is mentioned here to show it was inappropriate revenge. And David said to Joab and to all the people. It's interesting to me, this little phrase, all the people, is mentioned in verse 31, in verse 32, in verse 35, in verse 36, in verse 37. Again, David wants everyone to know, all of these northern elders who was there, the companions of Abner, this is not my fault. I did not mean to do this. I don't know what happened. I didn't plan this. I have no part of this. Now, so we're going to have a little chant here. All the people wept. They're going to have a state funeral for Abner. Now watch this. And David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, tear your clothes, gird on sackcloth, lament before Abner, and King David walked behind the bier. Now what this means is that he forced Joab to be a part of the state funeral for Abner. He had to wear the signs of mourning. He had to participate in the funeral, and I'm sure this was hard for Joab to do. They buried Abner at Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. Now the king's lament here for Abner is mentioned, and you can see that in verse 33 and 34. In verse 35, they try to get David to eat. Now, some Jewish groups say that this is the beginning of offering people food after a funeral. I'm not sure that's true. It's one of the first references to it. But David's not going to eat until the next day, until the sun goes down. The people of Israel heard this, and they were pleased that David was truly sorry. They believed he was not part of the murder of Abner, and it seems that they agree with that. All the people took note of it, and it pleased them, verse 36. Just as everything the king did pleased all the people, shows God's favor with him. Notice in verse 39, David kind of grieves over Joab's treacherous act, and he says that his Joab and Abishai are just too hard for him to control, and we know that Solomon will kill them after he comes to power. You might want to see 1 Kings 2, verses 5 and 6, and 1 Kings 2, 31 through 34. Now the short chapter 4. Now when Ish-bosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel was disturbed. Of course it was. He was the strong man, the power behind the throne. Now in verse 2 it mentions two, apparently of the bodyguards of Ish-bosheth, two of Saul's men, trusted men, and they're going to enter into the very house. First of all, in verse 4, it mentions there's only one more relative of Saul, a young man named Mephibosheth. Now, originally, his name is Merib-Baal. We see that from 1 Chronicles 8:24. Merib-Baal seems to be an opponent of Baal, or some change it slightly, loved by Baal. But again, the word Baal is changed into the Hebrew word for shame. Ish-bosheth. And so it changed to Mephibosheth, which means from the mouth of the shameful thing. Now, he was a young son of Jonathan that was dropped by his nurse and crippled. It's a way of showing there was no one to be king in Ish-bosheth's place. A crippled man could not be king. In verse 5 and 6, it shows how these men snuck into the house. Now, in the Greek version, it's a little bit longer here. It kind of puts the blame on two of the servants who it says were asleep. But these men were trusted men. They had had access to the king's palace. It mentions the king was taking a nap here in the noon. Apparently, he was by himself in his royal chamber. These two men entered the house with the pretense of getting food. They fell upon the king and killed him. They cut off his head and took his head to David. In verse 9 or so, they're going to come to David with the head. And David is going to be as displeased with them as he is with those who kill Saul. Again, in a sense, they killed the anointed king of Israel. And for whatever reason, maybe they thought they would get some money from David or be part of David's military establishment. We're not sure. But David does the same thing to them that he did to the young Amalekite in 2 Samuel chapter 1, and they're going to be killed. It's interesting to me that the word, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, again, as the Lord lives, is this play on the name Yahweh. The word Lord here in verse 9 is all caps, which is the Hebrew word to be, Exodus 3:14. The word redeemed is an interesting word. It has the idea of to buy someone back from economic slavery, military slavery, poverty. It also has the idea, it's the same as the word goel in the sense that there's two words in Hebrew for purchase and redeem. One means to buy back. The other has the idea of a personal agency of a near relative doing it. It's the word that comes to be used for God redeeming his people. And David, of course, uses that here. Notice David cuts off their hands and feet and hung them by the pool at Hebron. Now, of course, this mutilation was very significant. It was a form of terrible shame. The Philistines did this to Saul's body, cut off his head anyway. Apparently their hands because they killed the king, and their feet because they brought the head to David. And so it's a symbolic act, much like is done in the ancient Near East today. If you steal, in Islam, they cut off your hand. So you see it's kind of a way of again, David saying, I had no part of this. Now, much of these chapters have been David trying to distance himself from the evil acts of others, whether it's the Philistines or the Amalekite that killed Saul, supposedly, but I think Saul killed himself, or Joab killing Abner, or now these two men killing Ish-bosheth. David's trying to say, look, I had no part in that. I'm still a viable candidate for king. I've not taken part in any of these distasteful, unfair acts against Saul's family. And so I think you can see that as an undercurrent of this entire section. Well, I enjoyed being with you, and we'll study the rest of this next time. God bless you. Have a good day.